In the remote wilderness of Canada's Yukon territory, where temperatures can plummet to record-breaking lows and endless forests stretch beneath towering mountain ranges, 44 people disappeared into the frozen landscape and were never seen again. This was not a small aircraft flying off course. This was not a private plane lost in a storm. This was a massive military transport, a Douglas C-54D Skymaster, nearly 100 feet long with a wingspan wider than the length of 3 school buses. And yet, on January 26, 1950, it simply vanished. Among those aboard were 34 military servicemen returning from assignments in Alaska, a civilian technician heading home, and a young family that makes this tragedy particularly heartbreaking. Joyce Espe, 7 months pregnant with her second child, was traveling with her 23-month-old son, Victor, to Colorado, where she planned to give birth in a warmer climate. Her husband, Master Sergeant Robert Espe, had made sure they were seated next to his best friend, Sergeant Roy Jones, before the plane departed. His last words to his wife were a precaution, spoken with the careful concern of a military man who understood the risks of flying through the Yukon in winter. "If you have to jump, give the baby to Sergeant Roy Jones." Hours later, those words would haunt him. The plane never reached its destination. Despite one of the largest search and rescue operations ever conducted in North America at that time, despite the mobilization of thousands of troops and dozens of aircraft, despite weeks of intensive searching across hundreds of thousands of square miles of wilderness, no trace of the Skymaster or its 44 occupants has ever been found. 75 years later, the disappearance remains one of the single largest incidents of missing American military personnel and one of aviation's most baffling mysteries. What happened to Douglas C-54D Skymaster, serial number 4272469? How does a 17-ton aircraft with a 26-foot-high tail fin disappear over land without leaving a single piece of wreckage? This is the story of that aircraft, the people aboard it, the massive search that followed, and the families who have waited 3/4 of a century for answers that may never come. The aircraft, a workhorse of the skies. To understand this mystery, we must first understand the aircraft itself. The Douglas C-54D Skymaster was not some experimental prototype or aging relic prone to failure. It was a proven military transport, the backbone of America's airlift capability in the years following World War II. The C-54 was the military version of the Douglas DC-4, one of the most successful commercial airliners of its era. When the United States entered World War II, the War Department requisitioned all existing orders for DC-4 airliners and modified them with additional fuel tanks, designating them as the C-54 Skymaster. The D model, which entered service in 1944, featured uprated Pratt & Whitney R2011 twin Wasp radial engines, each delivering 1,350 horsepower. These 4 engines gave the aircraft a maximum speed of about 265 miles per hour and a service ceiling of 22,000 feet, though the unpressurized cabin typically limited operations to 10,000 feet when carrying passengers. The Skymaster was an impressive machine by any standard. It measured 93 feet 10 inches in length with a wingspan of 117 feet 6 inches. The aircraft had a maximum takeoff weight of around 62,000 pounds and could carry up to 44 passengers or an equivalent cargo load in its unpressurized fuselage. With a range of roughly 4,000 miles when lightly loaded, it was perfectly suited for transcontinental flights. During World War II, C-54s served in all theaters of operation, proving their reliability and capability. They hauled supplies across the Atlantic, ferried troops across the Pacific, and played crucial roles in keeping Allied forces supplied. After the war, these aircraft continued their service, most notably during the Berlin airlift of 1948 to 1949, when they ferried supplies to West Berlin during the Soviet blockade. The specific aircraft that would disappear over the Yukon, serial number 4272469, had been among those Berlin airlift veterans, accumulating approximately 4,387 flight hours by early 1950. This aircraft, manufactured in February 1945 with manufacturer's number 100574, was operated by the United States Air Force under Strategic Air Command. It was assigned to the 8th Air Force and the 97th Bomb Wing's 2nd Strategic Support Squadron, with its home base at Biggs Air Force Base in Texas. At the time of its disappearance, however, the aircraft was temporarily based at Elmendorf Air Force Base near Anchorage, Alaska, where it supported routine troop transport missions along northern routes. The C-54D had undergone a scheduled overhaul in August 1949, just 5 months before the fateful flight. The maintenance record showed no significant issues. This was not an aircraft held together with spare parts and prayers. This was a well-maintained military transport, with experienced maintenance personnel ensuring its airworthiness. By 1950, the Skymaster was beginning to be phased out of Air Force service, gradually replaced by the much larger Douglas C-124 Globemaster II. But large numbers of C-54s remained in use, continuing to prove their worth on routes across the United States, Alaska, and beyond. The aircraft was known for its reliability, its ability to handle harsh conditions, and its forgiving flight characteristics. Pilots trusted the Skymaster, all of which makes what happened next even more mysterious. The route, threading through the wilderness. The planned route for that January day would take the Skymaster from Elmendorf Air Force Base in Anchorage, Alaska, to Great Falls Air Force Base in Montana, a journey of approximately 1,700 miles that should have taken about 8 hours. This was a routine flight, one that military transports flew regularly, following established airways with radio checkpoints spaced at intervals along the route. The flight would follow Airway Amber 2, an air route established during World War II that roughly paralleled the Alaska Highway. This highway itself was a marvel of wartime engineering, built in 1942 to provide a land route to Alaska after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor made sea lanes vulnerable. The road connected a series of airfields known as the Northwest Staging Route, which extended from Montana through Alberta, British Columbia, and the Yukon all the way to Alaska and eventually into Siberia. The Northwest Staging Route had been crucial during the war for ferrying Lend-Lease aircraft to the Soviet Union. Airstrips were constructed approximately every 100 miles along the planned route of the Alaska Highway, each with its own radio station and emergency landing facilities. By 1950, this infrastructure remained in place, providing a network of navigation aids and emergency support for aircraft flying through this remote region. The route was as safe as any route through the sub-Arctic could be in 1950. Radio stations dotted the path, allowing aircraft to make regular position reports. Emergency airstrips offered refuge if weather or mechanical issues forced an unscheduled landing. The Alaska Highway below provided a visual reference for pilots and a potential escape route for anyone forced to make an emergency landing or evacuation. Still, this was the Yukon in January. The landscape below was unforgiving. Mountains towered to heights that left little margin for error when flying at 10,000 feet in an unpressurized aircraft. Forests stretched for hundreds of miles, broken only by frozen rivers and lakes. Temperatures regularly dropped to 40 or 50 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. In places like Snag, just 3 years earlier, the temperature had plummeted to minus 81.4 degrees Fahrenheit, the coldest temperature ever officially recorded in North America. This was wilderness in the truest sense. While the Alaska Highway connected small communities, vast stretches of territory remained unmapped and unexplored. A plane crashing in this landscape could easily disappear, swallowed by forests or hidden in deep valleys where snow would quickly cover any trace of wreckage. The crew of Skymaster 42-72469 understood these risks. They were experienced airmen who had flown through worse conditions. But understanding risk and eliminating it are two very different things. The crew, 8 men on a routine mission. Leading the 8-man crew was First Lieutenant Kyle E. McMichael, 28 years old, serving as aircraft commander and instructor pilot. The search operation that would follow the plane's disappearance would be named Operation Mike in his honor. Based on his dual role, McMichael appears to have been an experienced aviator qualified to both command and train other pilots on C-54 operations. The pilot was First Lieutenant Mike Tiesick, 25 years old, from Louise, West Virginia. The co-pilot position was filled by Major Gerald F. Britton, 36 years old, the most senior member of the crew by rank. Given Britton's age and rank, he likely brought significant flying experience to the crew, possibly including service during World War II. Tiesick was a graduate of Follansbee High School who had entered military service and flown transport planes in the Caribbean during the war. After the war, he had continued flying throughout the continental United States, gaining experience on various routes and in various conditions. He came from a close-knit family, and when news of the plane's disappearance broke, newspapers would publish photographs of his parents, brothers, and sisters gathered around a radio, listening to reports and hoping to hear that Mike was safe. First Lieutenant Joseph W. Metzler, 31 years old, served as the navigator. In an era before GPS and sophisticated navigation computers, the navigator's role was crucial. He plotted courses, monitored progress, calculated fuel consumption, and ensured the aircraft remained on the planned route. Metzler was married to Ruth Grahl Metzler, who never remarried after his disappearance, waiting the rest of her life for a husband who would never come home. Staff Sergeant Clarence A. Gibson, 35 years old, was the radio operator. His job was to maintain communication with ground stations, transmitting position reports, and receiving weather information and navigation guidance. Gibson's wife was pregnant with their third child, a daughter named Judy, whom he would never meet. He also left behind 2 little girls, ages 5 and 2. The engineering staff consisted of 3 men responsible for monitoring the aircraft's 4 engines and various systems during flight. Master Sergeant Clyde A. Streitman, 29 years old, served as the senior flight engineer. Technical Sergeant Harry W. McConaughey, 30 years old, and Staff Sergeant Raymond H. Snow, 24 years old, rounded out the engineering team. These men constantly monitored engine temperatures, fuel flow, oil pressure, and countless other parameters that kept a C-54 safely aloft. All 8 men were qualified, experienced, and trained for exactly this type of mission. They had flown through Alaska's winter conditions before. They understood the challenges. They knew the route. They had every reason to expect a routine, uneventful flight. The passengers. Lives in transit. Of the 36 passengers aboard the Skymaster that day, 34 were military personnel being transported from Alaska to various destinations in the continental United States. Some were completing tours of duty in Alaska. Others were heading to new assignments. Still others were going home on leave. Their names fill the passenger manifest like an honor roll of American service. Technical Sergeant Jack P. Ferris, Staff Sergeant Robert Ahern, Staff Sergeant Bernice T. Lively, Sergeant Ray L. Asel, Sergeant Donald W. Doggle, Corporal Albie P. Bovman, Private First Class John A. Shalopka, and dozens more. Each had his own story, his own reasons for being aboard that flight, his own family waiting for him somewhere. One was Corporal Raymond H. Matheny, known as a master baker who had created dishes for high-ranking military brass. Another was Sergeant Roy F. Jones, Master Sergeant Robert Espe's best friend, the man Espe had entrusted with his family's safety. Then there were the three civilians, Eldon V. Delansky from Sunnyside, Washington, whose specific role is not documented, but who was likely a civilian technician or contractor working on military installations in Alaska. Joyce Marilyn Espe, and her toddler son, Victor Robert Espe. Joyce Espe's story deserves particular attention, not because her loss was any greater than the others, but because her presence aboard that flight represents the human side of this tragedy in ways that resonate across the decades. Joyce was born on February 4, 1927, in Hapur, India, where her father worked and where she spent her early years at the Eden estate. She was the third of 8 children born to Burdeth L., Brenda Barnes Stanley, and Henry Charles Stanley. She grew up with her siblings, including brothers Kathleen and Eric Malcolm, and sisters Ruth and Barbara. During World War II, Joyce worked as a telephone operator in New Delhi, India, where she met Robert Espe, an American serviceman stationed with the Air Transport Command. After Robert returned from the war, he was honorably discharged, but within several months re-enlisted in the United States Air Force as a master sergeant at Fort Logan, Colorado. He was originally from Des Moines, Iowa. Joyce and Robert married in May 1947 in New York, beginning a life together that would take them wherever the Air Force sent them. Their son Victor was born on February 14, 1948. By all accounts, he was a happy toddler who loved sharing his meals with his father. At 23 months old, he was at that age where every day brought new words, new discoveries, new moments of wonder that parents treasure. By January 1950, Joyce was 7 months pregnant with their second child. The pregnancy had been difficult in Alaska's harsh climate. Joyce, who was described as very petite in stature, struggled with the extreme cold and the isolation of military life in the far north. Robert arranged for her to travel to Colorado, where she had friends in rifle, and where the warmer climate would make the final months of her pregnancy more bearable. She would stay with acquaintances there until the baby was born. Then Robert would join them. It was supposed to be a simple plan. Joyce and Victor would fly to Montana, then continue to Colorado. Robert would stay in Alaska to complete his duties, counting the days until he could meet his new child. Before they boarded the plane, he made sure Joyce and Victor were seated next to Roy Jones. His last words to his wife were practical, the kind of contingency planning that military men do instinctively. "If you have to jump, give the baby to Sergeant Roy Jones." She said she would. Those were the last words they ever spoke to each other. January 26, 1950. The day everything changed. The morning of January 26, 1950 began with complications. The Skymaster was scheduled for an earlier departure, but when the crew attempted to start the engines, they discovered trouble with one of the 4 Pratt & Whitney radials. This was not unusual. Aircraft engines, particularly the complex piston engines of that era, sometimes required maintenance or adjustment. The crew and ground personnel worked to resolve the issue, delaying the flight by several hours. By the time the engine problem was fixed and the aircraft was ready for departure, the day was advancing. In Alaska in January, daylight is precious. The sun rises late and sets early, leaving long hours of darkness that complicate flying, especially in an era before the sophisticated navigation aids and lighting systems that modern aircraft take for granted. At 5:16 p.m. local time, the tower at Elmendorf Air Force Base cleared First Lieutenant Kyle McMichael and his crew for takeoff. The Skymaster rolled down the runway, gathered speed, and lifted into the cold Alaskan twilight. The 4 engines roared their familiar sound, propellers biting into the frigid air, pulling the 17-ton aircraft skyward. The flight plan called for the Skymaster to fly east from Elmendorf, crossing from Alaska into Canadian airspace over the Yukon Territory, then continue southeast following the Alaska Highway through the Yukon, south through British Columbia, and finally into the United States. The total flight time was estimated at 8 hours. They would check in by radio at regular intervals, maintaining contact with ground stations at Snag, Aishihik, and Whitehorse before continuing south. The weather was typical for the Yukon in late January, which is to say, it was brutally cold and potentially treacherous. Just 3 days earlier, the area around Snag had been experiencing the tail end of a prolonged cold snap. 3 years earlier, on February 3, 1947, weather observer Gordon Toole had recorded a temperature of -81.4 degrees Fahrenheit at Snag Airport, a record that still stands as the coldest temperature ever officially recorded in North America. At such extreme temperatures, strange phenomena occur. Sound carries for miles through the dense, cold air. Exhaled breath freezes instantly with a hissing noise and hangs in the air at head level, creating vapor trails hundreds of meters long. Aircraft that fly overhead at 10,000 feet sound like they are landing at the airport. Ice on rivers cracks and booms like gunfire, the sounds amplified and carried across great distances by temperature inversions. While January 26, 1950 was not as cold as that record-breaking day 3 years earlier, temperatures in the region still hovered well below zero. Icing conditions were common. Clouds could form rapidly. Visibility could deteriorate without warning. The Skymaster was flying through one of the most challenging environments in North American aviation. 2 hours into the flight, at approximately 7:09 p.m. local time, the Skymaster reached its first mandatory radio checkpoint at Snag, Yukon. The crew made contact with the radio station, transmitting their routine position report. They reported their altitude as 10,000 feet, on course for the next checkpoint at Aishihik. The weather report they provided mentioned low visibility, some turbulence, and ice forming on the wings. These conditions were not unusual for the time of year and the location. Icing on wings was a known issue that pilots monitored carefully but could often manage. The crew gave no indication of distress or emergency. They confirmed the flight was continuing as planned. The next scheduled check-in was approximately 30 minutes later, when they should have reached Aishihik. That checkpoint was roughly 50 miles from Snag, an easy distance for the Skymaster flying at its cruising speed. But the Skymaster never checked in at Aishihik. Ground operators waited. Perhaps the crew was busy dealing with weather or navigation. Perhaps there was a temporary radio issue. Minutes passed, then more minutes. An hour went by with no word from the aircraft. At Great Falls Air Force Base in Montana, personnel began to realize something was wrong. The Skymaster should have arrived by now. It had not. No one had heard from the crew since the radio contact over Snag. No distress signal had been received. No emergency beacon had activated. The aircraft and all 44 people aboard had simply disappeared. Operation Mike. The search begins. Within an hour of the Skymaster's failure to check in at Aishihik, military officials launched what would become one of the largest search and rescue operations ever conducted in North America to that point. The operation was given a name, Operation Mike, after First Lieutenant Kyle E. McMichael, the aircraft commander. The search was launched under extraordinarily favorable circumstances, at least in terms of available resources. Unknown to the crew of the Skymaster, thousands of American and Canadian military personnel were already in the Yukon preparing for Exercise Sweetbriar, a joint United States-Canadian military training operation scheduled to begin on February 13th. The exercise was designed to test how combined forces could operate in subarctic conditions, simulating a scenario where communist forces had invaded Alaska from the west and Allied forces needed to drive them back. More than 5,000 troops had been ferried north for this exercise, along with approximately 1,000 motorized vehicles and 100 aircraft. The men and equipment were already in place, already acclimatized to the extreme conditions, already positioned in the exact region where the Skymaster was believed to have gone down. Within 20 hours of the plane's disappearance, 25 aircraft were already engaged in search operations. At its peak, Operation Mike would involve as many as 85 American and Canadian planes, along with 7,000 personnel searching approximately 165,000 to 350,000 square miles of rugged Yukon wilderness. The search area was centered on a 100-mile-wide strip along the flight plan airway from Snag to Whitehorse, which included both Aishihik and Whitehorse radio stations. Searchers divided this vast region into sectors, employing a combination of aerial surveys conducted by spotters in high-altitude transport planes, flying grid patterns, ground teams traversing the terrain on snowshoes and sleds, and support from radar installations and radio direction finding equipment. But the search faced formidable obstacles from the very beginning. Heavy snowfall blanketed the area for 3 days following the disappearance, covering any potential crash site with fresh snow and making visibility from the air extremely difficult. Temperatures plunged to around -40 degrees Fahrenheit. Daylight was scarce, with fewer than 6 hours of usable light each day in late January at that latitude. 30-plus planes flew through a heavy snowstorm and icing conditions for 4 hours on January 28th, just 2 days after the disappearance. As the Ohio-based Marysville Journal-Tribune reported, pilots said sighting a plane from the air would be extremely difficult given the terrain and conditions. The landscape itself conspired against the searchers. Mountains towered above the search aircraft, flying at relatively low altitudes. Dense forests covered much of the terrain, making it nearly impossible to spot wreckage from the air unless it had created a clearing by destroying trees. Hundreds of lakes, many of them frozen and snow-covered, offered countless places where an aircraft could have crashed through ice and sunk. Deep valleys, hidden by ridgelines, could conceal wreckage that would remain invisible to search aircraft flying overhead. Master Sergeant Robert Espe joined the search immediately. His desperation was evident in an essay he wrote that was published by the Associated Press on January 30th, just 4 days after his wife and son disappeared. "My wife and child are lost, and I'm absolutely just stunned. I haven't slept or eaten since Thursday, the day of the disappearance." He flew in search planes, scanning the endless white landscape below for any sign of the aircraft that carried his family. On Sunday morning, he boarded the first search plane to leave the base, spending about 9 hours in the air, staring at the snow and trees and mountains, finding nothing. "I've gone through the hysterics and cried myself silly," he admitted in his essay. The search was plagued by false leads from the beginning. The continuation of exercise Sweetbriar preparations, with aircraft constantly moving through the region, created confusion. Reports of smoke signals came in regularly, many of them likely from military camps or indigenous communities. Garbled radio communications were reported, raising hopes that the Skymaster crew might be alive and trying to signal their position, but these reports never led anywhere. On February 2nd, several planes and 2 radio stations in the Yukon area reported hearing unintelligible radio signals, including some near Aishihik, where the plane had failed to check in. Could it be the Skymaster? Were survivors trying to communicate? Search aircraft intensified their efforts in that area, but found nothing. As the Associated Press reported on February 6th, 2 more radio signals of no value were added tonight to the long list of clues checked and discarded in the 10-day search. Then there were the letters. People from across the continent sent reports of telepathic messages and dream revelations about the Skymaster's location. In an era before the cynicism of the internet age, search authorities felt obligated to check even these unlikely leads. Some writers claim to have seen the crash location in visions. Others described specific landmarks or coordinates that they insisted would lead searchers to the wreckage. Every claim had to be evaluated, resources allocated, and ultimately another disappointment recorded. This is one of the cruel paradoxes of search and rescue missions. The fear of overlooking a valuable lead means expending precious time and effort on repeated disappointments. Every false positive means less time searching in areas that might actually hold answers. The search was also dangerous for those conducting it. In this remote, mountainous terrain, in extreme cold and poor visibility, search aircraft themselves were at risk. On January 30th, a C-47 Dakota, Air Force serial number 45-1015 from the 57th Fighter Wing, stalled and crashed in the McClintock Mountains near Whitehorse while participating in the search. The pilot, First Lieutenant Charles Hardin, managed to walk 13 kilometers to the Alaska Highway, where he flagged down a truck and called for support for his 5 to 8 crew members. Remarkably, while the crew sustained injuries, there were no fatalities. On February 7th, a second C-47D, serial number 45-1037, from Eielson Air Force Base, crashed on a mountain slope south of Aishihik Lake. All 10 crew members aboard survived, but once again the incident demonstrated the dangers of the search itself and diverted resources to rescuing the rescuers. On February 16th, a Royal Canadian Air Force C-47, serial number KJ-936, crashed near Snag. Its 4 crew members sustained only light injuries, but the wreckage would later be temporarily mistaken for the missing Skymaster, raising hopes before dashing them again. 3 aircraft crashed during the search operation. Fortunately, all crew members survived, but these incidents reflected the dangers of the Yukon terrain and the challenging conditions that searchers face daily. If experienced military pilots flying in organized search patterns could crash, what chance did the Skymaster have if it encountered severe weather or mechanical failure? Despite all these efforts, despite the largest search operation ever mounted in this region to that date, despite flying thousands of sorties and covering hundreds of thousands of square miles, the searchers found nothing. Not a piece of wreckage, not an oil slick on a frozen lake, not a scar on a mountainside where trees had been knocked down, not a single item from the aircraft or from any of the 44 people aboard. The C-54D Skymaster, a 94-foot-long aircraft weighing 17 tons, with a tail fin standing 26 feet high, had disappeared without leaving any trace. The search abandoned. A nuclear emergency. On February 13, 1950, Exercise Sweetbriar was scheduled to commence. But that same day, something happened that would doom any hope of continuing the intensive search for the Skymaster. Shortly after midnight on February 14th, a Convair B-36 Peacemaker bomber, serial number 4492075, took off from Eielson Air Force Base near Fairbanks, Alaska, on what was supposed to be a routine training mission. The aircraft was part of a series of exercises designed to test whether the B-36 could conduct nuclear strikes against the Soviet Union during the Arctic winter. The bomber carried a Mark IV atomic bomb in its bomb bay, though the weapon did not contain its plutonium core and therefore could not produce a nuclear explosion. The B-36 was the first true intercontinental bomber, capable of carrying nuclear weapons to any part of the world. With 6 massive Pratt & Whitney R-4360 radial engines pushing the huge aircraft through the air, it was an impressive but complex machine. On this particular mission, the cold proved too much for the B-36's systems. 7 hours into the flight, ice began accumulating in the carburetor air intakes. 3 of the 6 engines began shooting flames and had to be shut down. The remaining 3 engines could not deliver full power. The crew realized they could not stay aloft. Following military protocol to prevent nuclear weapons from falling into enemy hands, they attempted to jettison the atomic bomb over the Pacific Ocean. When the bomb finally released, its conventional explosives detonated, creating a large explosion over the inside passage near Princess Royal Island. The crew then set the failing bomber on autopilot toward the open ocean and parachuted into the darkness over coastal British Columbia. 12 of the 17 crew members were rescued. 5 were never found, presumably having landed in the ocean and died of hypothermia. The unmanned B-36, however, did not crash into the ocean as expected. Instead, it veered from its set course and crashed into Mount Collegiate in northwestern British Columbia, more than 200 miles from where the crew had bailed out. The crash immediately became a national security emergency. A bomber carrying a nuclear weapon had gone down. While the Air Force insisted the bomb had been successfully jettisoned and destroyed, questions remained. Had the plutonium core really been removed? Where exactly had the bomb detonated? Could any radioactive material have survived the explosion? Where was the bomber wreckage? On February 14th, Operation Mike was indefinitely suspended. Search planes were pulled off looking for the Skymaster and sent instead to search for the B-36 and its missing atomic bomb. The families of the 44 people missing on the Skymaster were told that the search for their loved ones would have to wait. A crashed bomber with a nuclear weapon took precedence over a missing transport plane. Canadian authorities were never told that the B-36 had been carrying a nuclear weapon, a fact that would not be publicly acknowledged until 1981, when the United States government released information about the incident in a summary of nuclear weapons accidents from 1950 to 1980. The crash was designated as Broken Arrow No. 1, the first of what would eventually be 8 incidents in which U.S. nuclear weapons were lost or involved in accidents. The B-36 wreckage would not be found until August 1953, when a Royal Canadian Air Force airplane spotted it on the side of Mount Collegiate. By then, the Skymaster had been forgotten by everyone except the families who continued to wait for news that would never come. Closure without answers. On February 20th, 1950, Operation Mike was officially cancelled. Notifications were sent to next of kin, informing them that their loved ones were presumed dead. Death certificates were issued, providing the legal documentation necessary for families to begin the painful process of moving forward with their lives. But how does one move forward when there are no bodies to bury, no graves to visit, no physical evidence that death has actually occurred? The families of the 44 people aboard the Skymaster faced a unique kind of grief, one without closure, without finality, without any way to truly say goodbye. Master Sergeant Robert Espe's pain was particularly acute. For Espe, the loss of his wife and son was compounded by the fact that Joyce was carrying their second child. He had lost not just 2 members of his family, but 3. And he had lost them without any answers about what had happened, where they were, or whether they had suffered. Espe would later remarry, wedding Mary Jo Ingram in Minden, Louisiana, and would try to rebuild his life. But those who knew him said he never truly recovered from the loss. He spoke of Joyce and Victor in the present tense. He celebrated their birthdays. He was always telling stories about them, keeping their memory alive. He maintained a room in his house dedicated to his lost wife and son, with a ham radio where he could listen to the frequencies, perhaps hoping against hope that somehow, someday, a signal would come through. Robert Espe died in October 1968, 18 years after the disappearance. He never learned what happened to his family. Judy Jackson, the daughter of radio operator Clarence Gibson, was born after her father disappeared. She never knew him except through photographs and stories. I would rather know that he died instantly than if they did have some survivors and they froze to death, she said decades later. I don't think I could stand that. I just hope it was instant. I just don't understand why there's not been any more searches done for that airplane. It's just a mystery. Joseph Metzler's widow, Ruth Grahl-Metzler, never remarried. She waited for a husband who would never return, choosing to honor his memory rather than move on with someone new. Jeannie Stanley, Joyce Espe's niece, grew up knowing about her aunt who had vanished. That was part of our life growing up, knowing about Joyce going missing, she recalled. And we just hope that one day they will find her. They will find the plane. These stories repeat across all 44 families. Children who grew up without fathers, parents who lost sons, wives who became widows without confirmation, siblings who waited for brothers who never came home. Theories and speculation. In the 75 years since the Skymaster's disappearance, various theories have been proposed to explain what might have happened. None have been proven. All remain speculation in the absence of physical evidence. The most straightforward explanation, based on the available evidence, is that the aircraft encountered severe weather or mechanical failure somewhere between Snag and Aishihik and crashed in the wilderness. The Yukon in January is unforgiving. Icing on wings, which the crew reported at Snag, can quickly become severe. If ice accumulated faster than the crew could manage, it's possible this could have affected the aircraft's ability to maintain altitude. The Skymaster was flying at 10,000 feet through mountainous terrain. There was not much margin for error. Some have suggested that the aircraft might have encountered a sudden, catastrophic mechanical failure. Perhaps an engine fire that spread to the wing structure. Perhaps a structural failure in the tail or fuselage. Perhaps a problem with the flight controls. While no evidence supports any particular failure scenario, any of these could theoretically have brought the aircraft down quickly, possibly too quickly for the crew to send a distress signal. Another theory suggests the aircraft might have crashed into a frozen lake. In January, many of the Yukon's hundreds of lakes are covered with thick ice and deep snow. Based on this scenario, a pilot facing an emergency might attempt to land on what appeared to be a flat, open surface, only to discover too late that it was a frozen lake. If the aircraft broke through the ice, the lake could have swallowed it entirely. When spring came and the ice melted, the wreckage would have sunk to the bottom, hidden from view. A variation on this theory suggests the aircraft might have made an emergency landing on a frozen lake successfully, but that survivors then froze to death in the extreme cold. Under this scenario, the aircraft would have gone through the ice during spring thaw, leaving no trace. This theory is particularly haunting for families who prefer to believe their loved ones died instantly, rather than suffering through hours or days of exposure in -40-degree temperatures. Weather is another possibility that investigators have considered. While the crew reported conditions at Snag, weather in the mountains can change rapidly. A sudden storm could have reduced visibility to zero, disorienting the crew and causing them to fly into a mountain. The strong winds that were reported in the region that day, potentially reaching 50 to 70 knots aloft, could have blown the aircraft off course, carrying it west into the St. Elias Mountains rather than south toward Aishihik. Some researchers have suggested the aircraft might have crashed on or near the Burwash Glacier along the northeast flank of Mount Hoge, approximately 12 miles west of Burwash Landing and roughly 75 miles west-southwest from Aishihik. This area is covered by permanent glaciers and rugged terrain. There is no record of this area being searched during Operation Mike. If the aircraft went down in this region, glacial movement over the decades could have covered or destroyed any wreckage, making it nearly impossible to find. However, this remains speculation without physical evidence to support it. Then there are the more exotic theories. In 1950, the United States was in the early years of the Cold War, and UFO sightings were frequently reported and taken seriously by military authorities. Incidentally, there were 2 contemporary reports of unidentified flying objects by officers stationed at Elmendorf Air Force Base around the time of the Skymaster's disappearance. On April 19th, Sergeant William Y. Harrell reported from the control tower that he had seen 2 UFOs hovering over a hangar emitting a green light, a report backed by other soldiers at the base. On January 28th, just 2 days after the Skymaster disappeared, Lieutenant Colonel Lester F. Matheson reported seeing 3 orange cigar-shaped UFOs flying in tandem above the base. Both cases were investigated by the Alaskan Air Command, who ruled only that the objects were neither weather phenomena nor recognized aircraft. The timing of these sightings, particularly the one on January 28th, has led some to speculate about a connection to the Skymaster's disappearance. However, there is no evidence linking these sightings to the missing aircraft. The reports were investigated and filed, and no connection to the disappearance was ever established. It is far more likely that the UFO sightings were misidentifications of conventional aircraft, atmospheric phenomena, or simply the heightened awareness and stress that comes with having a major search operation underway. What we do know is this: the last confirmed position of the Skymaster was over Snag at approximately 7:09 p.m. local time on January 26, 1950. The aircraft should have reached Aishihik approximately 30 minutes later. It never did. Something happened in that 50-mile stretch of wilderness, in that 30 minutes of flight time, that brought down a 17-ton aircraft and killed 44 people without leaving any trace that searchers could find. Why the Skymaster remains unfound. Perhaps the most puzzling aspect of this case is not what happened to cause the crash, but how an aircraft of this size could disappear so completely. This is not a small private plane. This is not a fighter aircraft with a narrow profile. This is a transport plane nearly 100 feet long, with a wingspan of 117 feet and a tail fin standing 26 feet high. Even in pieces, there should be something to find. Part of the answer lies in the sheer scale and nature of the terrain. The Yukon Territory covers approximately 910,000 square kilometers, about 350,000 square miles. Much of it remains wilderness even today. Immense forests cover vast stretches of land. Deep ravines cut through the landscape. Ice fields and permanent glaciers mantle the higher elevations. There are more than 200 major lakes, countless smaller ones, and thousands of miles of rivers. Searching this landscape effectively is extraordinarily difficult. From the air, wreckage can be nearly impossible to spot under the forest canopy. In winter, fresh snow covers everything within hours. In summer, vegetation grows rapidly, concealing anything on the forest floor. Unless wreckage created a large clearing by destroying trees, or unless it landed in an open area like a lake or meadow, it could easily remain hidden even from searchers passing relatively close by. The lack of pilot training in search and rescue tactics in 1950 also played a role. Operation Mike was organized quickly, mobilizing available resources without the benefit of modern search and rescue doctrine. Defined search patterns were not consistently used. Coverage of areas was not systematic. False leads drew resources away from more promising search zones. While the searchers did their best under difficult circumstances, the techniques and technology available to them were primitive compared to modern search and rescue capabilities. Weather and daylight limitations severely restricted search operations. Heavy snowfall in the days immediately following the disappearance covered any potential crash site. Temperatures of -40 degrees Fahrenheit made it difficult for search crews to remain effective during long missions. With only about 5 hours of usable daylight in late January at that latitude, search aircraft could only fly for brief windows each day. The Yukon government maintains a database of more than 500 airplane crashes in the territory. All of them have been located and accounted for except one, the Skymaster. This statistical fact underscores just how unusual this case is. Over the decades since 1950, hundreds of aircraft have gone down in the Yukon. Hunters have stumbled across wreckage. Hikers have found crash sites. Modern satellite imagery and improved search techniques have located many previously unknown wrecks. But not the Skymaster. Some have suggested that modern technology offers hope of finally solving this mystery. Ground-penetrating radar could potentially locate wreckage hidden under vegetation or snow. Satellite imagery analysis, particularly using infrared and other spectral bands, might reveal anomalies in the forest or glacier surfaces. LiDAR scanning, which uses laser pulses to create detailed three-dimensional maps of terrain, could penetrate forest canopy and reveal signs of impact. But the challenge remains the same as it was in 1950. Where do you look? The search area remains enormous. Even with modern technology, you cannot effectively search hundreds of thousands of square miles hoping to find a single aircraft. You need to narrow the search zone, and that requires evidence or analysis to identify the most likely areas. Recent efforts, keeping hope alive. The families of the missing have never stopped hoping for answers. In 2012, descendants of the missing servicemen started a petition through the We the People petition system, seeking to resurrect the search for their family's remains. The petition garnered attention, but did not result in a renewed official search. In 2020, filmmaker Andrew Gregg was named as director of an upcoming documentary about the search for the aircraft, titled Skymaster Down. The documentary aired in Canada on January 16, 2022, on CBC's Documentary Channel. Gregg's film brought renewed attention to the case, interviewing family members and presenting the historical context of the disappearance. Paul Vilga, the grandnephew of First Lieutenant Mike Tiesick, one of the Skymaster's pilots, has been particularly active in keeping the case alive. He has worked to organize family members, gather historical information, and advocate for renewed search efforts. In 2022, inspired by Gregg's documentary, a new group formed in Whitehorse to search for the fallen Skymaster. The Civil Air Search and Rescue Association and volunteers have been supporting the families who have decided to revive the search that the American government gave up on 72 years earlier. Donna Clayson and Dave Downing from the Civil Air Search and Rescue Association have been particularly involved in planning renewed search efforts. Clayson, though she has never met the families personally, feels a connection to them. That connection motivates her to help search for the aircraft. It could be a military dog tag, a cut of metal, or a twist of fabric, she has said. Uncovering even the smallest thing from a plane that disappeared more than 70 years ago has the power to change lives. The renewed interest has generated hope. As filmmaker Andrew Gregg observed, 75 years later, it's amazing how many people are waiting for closure on this. Claire Fowler, now in his 90s and living in Ottawa, was a civilian radio operator at Snag in 1950. He recalls the flurry of United States and Canadian military aircraft landing at their remote airstrip during the search for the lost Skymaster. "I was 22 when I was there, in Snag," he says. "I'm probably the only guy alive now that was there at the time." His memories provide a direct link to those desperate days in January and February 1950, when hopes remained high that survivors would be found. But finding the Skymaster will not be easy. The families know this. The searchers know this. Yet the drive continues, fueled by the fundamental human need for closure, for answers, for the ability to finally lay loved ones to rest. Kathy Lewers, Robert Espe's stepdaughter from his second marriage, remembers how he spoke of Joyce and Victor. He would celebrate their birthdays, she recalls. He was always telling stories about them, how funny Victor was. Even decades after their disappearance, Robert kept them alive in his heart and mind, unable to move on without knowing what happened. This is what drives the continued search. Not just the mystery of how an aircraft could vanish, but the very human need to bring families home, to provide closure, to honor the memory of those who were lost. The broader context: aviation in the North. The loss of the Skymaster, while tragic and mysterious, was not unique in the history of Alaskan and Yukon aviation. The region has a long and often dark history of aircraft accidents and disappearances. The so-called father of Alaskan aviation, Carl Ben Eielson, died in a plane crash in 1929. His death occurred just weeks after he participated in the search for another aviation pioneer, Russell Merrill, whose body was never found. A third legendary pilot, Harold Gillam, participated in the Eielson search. Gillam later froze to death after crashing in 1943. As aviation journalist Colleen Mondor, who specializes in Alaska aviation, notes, "When they die in Alaska, it's in ones and twos and threes, so the Skymaster is famous because it's a lot of people. But there were a lot of other accidents in the 1940s and the 1950s that were ones and twos and threes." Flying in Alaska and the Yukon in the 1940s and 1950s was dangerous work. The aircraft of that era were less reliable than modern planes. Navigation equipment was primitive. Weather forecasting was rudimentary. Communications were limited. Pilots flew by dead reckoning and pilotage, using maps, compasses, and visual landmarks to find their way. When weather closed in, they had few options. Emergency landing strips like those along the northwest staging route helped, but they were few and far between. If a pilot got into trouble between airstrips, his options were limited. He could try to reach the next strip. He could attempt an emergency landing on a frozen lake or open ground. Or he could try to keep flying and hope the problem resolved itself. The Skymaster disappeared during this transitional period in aviation history. The great advances of World War II had produced better aircraft, better engines, and better navigation equipment. But these improvements had not yet filtered down to eliminate the risks of northern flying. The aircraft were more capable, but nature remained unforgiving. Today, aviation in the North is far safer. Modern aircraft have redundant systems, sophisticated navigation equipment, and the ability to fly in weather that would have grounded pilots in 1950. But people still die. Aircraft still crash. The wilderness still claims victims. The difference is that modern search and rescue capabilities mean that most crashes are found relatively quickly, and fewer people die as a result. The fact that the Skymaster remains unfound after 75 years is both a testament to the scale and nature of the Yukon wilderness and a reminder of just how much has changed in aviation safety and search and rescue capability since 1950. Conclusion: the mystery endures. On a cold January evening in 1950, 44 people climbed aboard a Douglas C-54D Skymaster in Anchorage, Alaska. Among them were military men heading home, a civilian technician, and a young pregnant mother with her toddler son. They were flying a routine route, following an established airway, checking in regularly by radio. Everything was normal. 2 hours later, the aircraft checked in at Snag, reporting icing on the wings, but no other problems. 30 minutes after that, the aircraft should have checked in at Aishihik. It never did. The Skymaster and everyone aboard disappeared, leaving no trace, generating no distress signal, providing no clues about what had happened or where they went down. 75 years have passed. The families who waited for news in 1950 are mostly gone now, replaced by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who carry the burden of this unresolved mystery. Master Sergeant Robert Espe died without learning what happened to his wife and son. Radio operator Clarence Gibson's daughter, Judy, never knew her father. Navigator Joseph Metzler's widow never remarried. The Yukon wilderness keeps its secrets. Somewhere in that vast landscape of forests and mountains, frozen lakes and glaciers, lies the wreckage of a C-54D Skymaster. Perhaps it rests at the bottom of a deep lake. Perhaps it is scattered across a mountainside, slowly being reclaimed by the forest. Perhaps it lies on a glacier, covered by decades of snow and ice. Perhaps it has been found by someone who had no idea what they were looking at, its identity unknown, because time and weather have erased all markings. What happened to Douglas C-54D Skymaster, serial number 4272469? How does a 94-foot-long aircraft with a 26-foot-high tail fin disappear over land without leaving a single piece of wreckage that searchers can find? These questions have no answers. Perhaps they never will. But the search continues. Families keep hoping. Researchers keep investigating. Volunteers keep planning renewed search efforts. Modern technology offers new possibilities. Satellite imagery, ground-penetrating radar, LiDAR mapping, crowdsourced analysis of historical records, and terrain features. Somewhere out there, the Skymaster is waiting to be found. The 44 people who vanished with it deserve to come home. The families who have waited 75 years deserve answers. The mystery deserves to be solved. Until that day comes, the disappearance of the Skymaster remains one of aviation's most haunting, unsolved mysteries. 44 souls lost in the frozen wilderness, disappeared without a trace, leaving only questions that echo across 3/4 of a century. If you have been touched by this story, if you know someone who might have information, or if you are interested in supporting renewed search efforts, please visit the Operation Mike website or contact the Civil Air Search and Rescue Association. Perhaps together, we can finally bring these 44 people home. Until then, we remember Joyce Espe and her son, Victor. We remember the 8 crew members who flew the Skymaster that day. We remember the 34 military personnel heading home. We remember Eldon Delansky. We remember all 44 people who boarded that flight on January 26, 1950, and disappeared into the vast Yukon wilderness, never to be seen again. Their story deserves to be told. Their families deserve answers. And the mystery of the vanished Skymaster deserves to be solved. Thank you for listening to Lore 2 Mystery. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe, leave a review, and share it with others who appreciate the mysteries of history. Until next time, stay curious and remember that some of the greatest mysteries are the ones that remain unsolved.